Good evening. Thank you all so much for having me here. I'm really excited to share with you some of Lewis Miller's work and some details about his life. And the Montgomery Museum is very pleased to have me here to speak to you all about our museum's namesake. So, Lewis Miller was born in 1796 to German immigrant parents in York, Pennsylvania. His father was a schoolmaster, and he provided Lewis Miller with a classical education. After that was completed at age 17, Lewis was apprenticed to his brother John to learn carpentry and house building. Lewis Miller was one of 10 children in the family, and this was his older brother. Lewis Miller never earned his living as an artist, but rather he worked as a carpenter, and sometimes via the carpentry work he worked as an architectural sculptor. And he worked on a number of important buildings throughout the town of York, which was experiencing a building boom during this period, and so Miller was a carpenter in York for about 30 years. Lewis Miller's scholar, Barbara Luck, she's also the curator at Colonial Williamsburg, or former curator at Colonial Williamsburg, wrote that Miller defied classification. He was an artist, a carpenter, a historian, as well as a botanist, a comedian, a eulogizer, linguist, musician, naturalist, philosopher, poet, songwriter, sculptor, travel writer, and zoologist. He produced nearly 2,000 drawings during his life, and about 200 of these are thought to be of subject matter in the South. Above all, I think Lewis Miller was an acute observer. He noticed things. He recorded things. He sketched people from all walks of life doing all manner of things. His work is full of historical information about early American life, including how work was done, what tools were used, how they were used, and the interactions between the people doing the business at hand, whether that be work or play. Miller wrote once, "They are true sketches, I myself being there upon the place and spot." He really saw himself as a chronicler of life, and his work has something of a scrapbook quality to it. In this sketch, which is of a house in Wytheville, which apparently Miller stopped at on one of his various rambles through our area, because the Reverend Lewis was a collector of geological specimens, and he stopped to see those specimens. But notice the careful way that he's depicted the house and the outbuildings, one of which we can presume was the kitchen, being smoke coming out the chimney. We see that there's work being done, also play being done by the children in the yard. There's a cow in the yard, but also the fence line. He didn't even leave out the ladder or the rain barrel at the corner of the main house. The detail is astounding, and I don't have a photographic record of this sketch, but I wonder if it wasn't very accurate for the house itself. Miller sketched important historical scenes, people, places, but he also recorded everyday adventures and misadventures, such as this railroad accident in Pulaski County on June 27, 1856, which came to pass, he wrote, with no life lost. The other sketch is of a horse accident on the road to Christiansburg in 1865, and that was near Emmeline Craig's farm, which is to say Hans Meadow, near Christiansburg. And that's a detail of a larger drawing, and you can see that in the wagon is someone with crutches. Apparently Miller was accompanying several people who was taking what he referred to as invalids to the train at Big Spring, and someone came up too quickly on a horse, and the horse reared, and the person fell off into a deep ditch, and they missed the train. Miller also had a deep interest in travel, and I think this was born from his desire to record. He wanted to see everything, to understand everything. He began his traveling fairly close to home throughout Pennsylvania in the 1820s and 1830s. He first visited Baltimore in 1837, and then in 1840, and this was shortly after the death of both of his parents, he made a major tour of Europe. He visited his family's ancestral home in Germany, and he continued throughout much of Europe and England. In 1842, right on the heels of that trip, he visited New York, Central Park, and he had nephews who lived in New York City, Long Island, Brooklyn area. His European travels fostered an interest in history and military history. I think of all Lewis Miller's character traits, modesty may not have been one of them. He prepared a sketchbook based on his interest in military history called Ludovicus Miller's Historia of War, a General History of War. And this was in 1851. Miller was a deeply religious and deeply spiritual person. He was a devout Christian. His work often explores religious themes. He seems to have found inspiration in natural beauty. Oftentimes his sketches of landscapes have small poetry phrases on them that have a religious theme. This work is called The Last Supper of Christ, and it depicts the Last Supper as well as other Christian motifs and ideas. And the arrangement is really interesting when you look at it. It's sort of a hierarchy, and it's using a temple as a metaphor. So if we look at the lower left pillar, it reads, the script reads, "And we are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone." So again, he's returning to his architectural knowledge and background as a metaphor for his other beliefs and interests. Though Miller was a bachelor for all of his life, he was deeply devoted to his family, and he was very close to his nieces and nephews. He had a lot of them, with 9 brothers and sisters. He also was close to many of his great nieces and great nephews. He made the first of his 15 documented trips to Virginia in 1831, and most of his Virginia trips were to visit his brother, Dr. Joseph Miller, who lived in Christiansburg. He also visited his brother John, who had moved to Rockingham County, and he visited his brother Benjamin, who was living in Upshur County, West Virginia. Of course, then it was still known as Virginia. Miller's Virginia trips were recorded in at least three separate sketchbooks. The Sketchbook of Landscapes in the State of Virginia, which was done in 1853, the Virginia Sketchbook, 1856, 1857, and Orbis Pictus, A View of the World, a picturesque album to the ladies of York, Pennsylvania, in 1849. It's apparent from all of his Virginia work that he loved our area. He was enthralled with the natural beauty and the people and buildings that he saw here. This drawing is of the Dr. Joseph Eady family, and it illustrates a couple of things. First is Miller's thrifty use of paper, but more importantly, it gives us explicit detail about his feelings for his family and our region. The drawing was likely made in 1856, and we know that because that's the date that the baby was born that she's holding. All of the family members are labeled, and the baby was born, we know, in 1856. But the drawing was actually done on what appears to be the top part of a letter, or maybe a draft of a letter that was written by Miller to his niece, Amanda Eady, in 1851. And Amanda Eady is probably the woman holding the child, and she was the child's mother. Miller writes, "It will, before long, be 2 years since I had the pleasure of seeing you all, Mother, Emmeline, Amanda, Mary, Charles, and all the children, and the old neighbors. I am often in a dream in John Craig's meadow, gathering flowers." And this last reference is again a reference to Craig's property of Hans Meadow, where we know Miller was oftentimes a house guest. And it gives us a window into what he did when he was visiting his family. We knew he traveled through our area based on his sketches, but it seems he also enjoyed quieter pleasures on Craig's very large farm. Miller's feelings for his family prompted him to create a number of sketches, poems, valentines, and other tokens of affection, especially for his female relatives. This valentine, made for his niece, is replete with sentimental, often somber verse. He writes, "She hears me not, she cares not, nor will she list to me. Oh, take me to the arms, my love, for it is bitter cold. Tell her I only ask, she'll think of me, sweet rose." And elsewhere on the valentine it says, "How sweet at close of silent eye the harp's responsive sound. Remember, dear, life footsteps runs, and hours flow from thy time." This sentimentality is a very Victorian kind of manner, and it contrasts, I think, with his more classical ideas that we saw in the Last Supper sketch. He's embodies it two different things, I think: his classical education from his father and from that time period, and then the later Victorian era, which was full of sentimentality. Miller's nephew, Charles Miller, was the son of Dr. Joseph Miller, and he was Lewis Miller's most frequent traveling companion. He's in many of the sketches, and they traveled on numerous trips through Virginia countryside, and he also accompanied his uncle to New York City. It seems appropriate to me that Miller, who loved to document the quirks of nature, the quirks of other people, was himself a quirky personality. Surviving letters at the York County, Pennsylvania Heritage Trust and at the Montgomery Museum dovetail together to give us a window into his ways. It appears that his nieces, Ellen Craig and Emmeline Eady, both accompanied him in 1876 to Philadelphia to see the Centennial Exposition there. On October 9th, 1876, Ellen Craig writes home to Christiansburg, not from Philadelphia, but from York, and she writes, "Uncle Lewis got very impatient at the delays we met with, and made, in consequence, a very considerable display of the disposition on the cars before some very nice people. But more of this when I get home." I would have loved to have heard the rest of that. Later on, she's obviously a bit irritated at poor Uncle Lewis, and she writes, "Uncle L was too proud to bring us to Mrs. Quickle's that night." And Mrs. Quickle was another niece. "For we were all three very dirty from traveling so much. So he put us up at the farmer's hotel." And she's obviously very displeased that she had to go to the hotel. Miller's body of drawings includes polished works that may have been done after the fact from quick on-site sketches, but more frequently his work is characterized by these quick on-site sketches themselves. The color image is a print that's in a private collection, and it's typical of his Virginia sketches. They were filled with action, they made use of quick, sharp ink pen strokes, and they were washed strategically with watercolor to give them form. The negative image shows one of his more polished drawings, and that's a drawing of Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And the most polished of his work seems to be those from his European travels, and we know that he seems to have been planning some sort of book from those, and he went back and redid a lot of the European sketches after the fact. It may be relevant here for me to give you a little bit of background about how Miller's work came down to us in our time. The York County Heritage Trust in Pennsylvania owns the greatest number of Miller's sketches, but their collection focuses largely on the Pennsylvania subject matter. It seems that Miller's Virginia relatives inherited many of his local works, and at least 3 of the sketchbooks are now at the Virginia Historical Society and at the Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller Folk Art Center at Colonial Williamsburg. We know that Miller's great-great-niece, Eva Figet Rousseau, sold 2 of the sketchbooks to the old print shop in New York City. And around this time, the FAR, or FAR Gallery in New York, created 12 prints from those sketchbooks. And these are the prints, the color prints that I'm showing you, or the FAR Gallery prints. About this time, which probably was in the 1930s or 40s, portions of the sketchbooks were also photographed with black and white images. And those negatives are owned by the Montgomery Museum. And so those are the black and white images that I'm showing you, are from the museum's collection. And you can see too how the FAR Gallery cleaned up his work in order to print it. Miller always made captions and notations, sometimes seemingly unrelated captions, notations, and poetry on top of his sketches. And so you see how they've taken that out of the top of the sketch. As this page illustrates, Miller treated his work as both art and scrapbook, diary, travel journal. He was thrifty with paper, as we've seen. He often drew multiple pictures on the same piece of paper. He used freight bills, advertisements, old letterhead, timetables, any kind of recycled paper that he could get his hands on. He also used planed and lined paper for his work. I think that this page is particularly interesting because it's really illustrative of how he treated his work as a journal, as a daily journal. He writes about what the weather is, but he also writes just thoughts, random thoughts that came to mind, such as, "I found the names of those I love in some of my old papers." And the man is apparently unidentified. Miller made a number of memorial sketches of friends and relatives, and he memorialized his great-nephew, Charles T. Eady, after Eady was murdered at Hampton-Sydney College in 1857. The sketch was likely done from this photograph of Eady, which was taken in 1856. At first, it seems that Miller's scrapbook style placed Eady's image in the corner of an unassociated sketch, but upon research, it becomes apparent that it was probably purposeful. The Eady family actually resided in the first block of West Main Street, and their house is pointed out with the blue arrow. And I'm sure that Miller spent a lot of his time with the Eady family in that house. He could even have been in Christiansburg in 1857 when Eady was killed. We don't really know. Miller's work as carpenter likely fueled his strong interest in architecture, and this interest is very evident in his sketches. In 1856, he sketched his nephew's commanding new home, which still stands on South Franklin Street in Christiansburg. And Miller often commented about buildings. They're very common subject matter for him. The poetry that he wrote on this sketch was taken out of the FAR Gallery print, but it reads, "The stately homes of Virginia, how beautiful they stand." This local sketch on the right is a photograph of one of his sketches, and it's the Bank House in Christiansburg, which was originally the Bank of the Valley and later the Bank of Christiansburg. And this building stood on the town square in Christiansburg until 1963. And you see that his rendering is right on. Notice he made the balustrade have circular little motifs instead of oval, but other than that, it's spot on. The balustrade could easily have been deteriorated by the time this circa 1900 photograph was taken. Lewis Miller moved to Christiansburg sometime before 1870. In the 1870 census, he's in the household of his nephew, Charles Miller. In 1874, we know that he was living with his niece, Amanda Miller Eady, probably on West Main Street. He also lived with his niece, Emmeline Miller Craig, at Hans Meadow. And this is a late 19th century photograph of Hans Meadow. And that house, of course, still stands as well, although it's been altered in the early 20th century. According to the 1880 census, Miller was living with the Montgomery County farmer named Chester Charlton and his wife, Kate. And no one really knew who Chester Charlton was exactly, but someone had suggested that he may have been a relative of Joseph Eady's wife, Matilda Charlton Eady. Matilda Charlton Miller. And I did some genealogy research, and it was Matilda Charlton and Chester Charlton were first cousins, so that may have been the connection, how Miller knew them. But it appears like it was not necessarily a family type of arrangement, because Miller wrote to a York relative in February 1882, "My relations that were good to me are dead. Now I am with strangers, and they look for pay." Miller's comments are a little bit interesting, because it seems that maybe he had stayed out his welcome with his relatives, because even though he says that his relatives that were good to him are dead, we know that Charles Miller and Emmeline Craig were both still very much alive in 1882. So not quite right, Uncle Louie. So we don't know what happened there, but it seems that something may have. And it also is pretty clear that Miller was in financial difficulty by this point in his life. Letters written to Lewis Miller that are in the York collection in 1881 and 1882 often speak about his friends in York sending him monetary gifts. In some cases, it appears that these gifts were actually in exchange for his artistic work, or as one writer called it, your curiosities. Lewis Miller died in Christiansburg, perhaps at Hans Meadow, on September 15, 1882, and he is buried in the Craig family cemetery near Hans Meadow. Miller's friend, the poet Henry Fisher of York, wrote Miller's obituary for the York newspaper, and in 1886 he called attention to Miller's work in an illustrated biographical essay. In both of these works, Fisher celebrated Miller's artistic abilities, both his sketches and sculpture, as well as his poetry and songs. With growing interest in the 1930s for early Americana, Miller's work began to gain attention, and in 1955, Life magazine printed a number of his sketches in color. Historians were the first to recognize his work because it's such a wonderful record of that time and places. Art historians followed by the mid-century, calling out his work for its artistic qualities, and the York Heritage Trust published a monograph of his work in 1966. The Montgomery Museum and Lewis Miller Regional Art Center in Christiansburg is celebrating our 30th anniversary, and the museum serves the whole of Montgomery County, and our mission of promoting art and history is personified in Miller, our namesake. He neatly spans both of those fields. The museum is very pleased to announce a special new exhibit that will open this summer, and it will be called Lewis Miller's New River Valley. The exhibit will celebrate the unveiling of 3 never-before exhibited sketches and will further explore Miller's life and work in our area.